We were told to sit in the middle section. Keep your butt back over. Me too. So bad. She doesn't look very sick.
We want to wait a few minutes because we see people moving in. Good evening and welcome to Sanctuary Community Church for our seminar on gender and sexual identity led by Katie Mborick. We're glad to welcome you all here and to say hello to all of you joining us by live stream. We wanted to host this seminar in conjunction with a Sunday teaching series here at Sanctuary that we're calling God, Gender, and Human Sexuality. You're welcome to listen to those teachings on our podcast or to see the videos on YouTube. So let me just take a minute to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Katie Mborick is a family medicine physician at the University of Iowa's Hospital and Clinics and the co-director of UIHC LGBTQ Clinic. Katie's been a leader and advocate in providing outstanding medical care as well as patient advocacy for the LGBTQ community, and her work has been recognized in many ways over the past several years. One of her most recent awards was this past December when she was voted the most trusted physician in Iowa City, Cedar Rapids area by Little Village Magazine.
I was not the best physician, just the most trusted.
None of us are surprised that she's the most trusted. And Katie and her wife, Paula, and 2 children have been part of Sanctuary now for several years, so please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Katie Mborick.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for braving the weather. My wife is pulling my brother-in-law out of a ditch right now, so I think she may maybe join us live. We don't actually have internet, though, because the wind is blowing so bad, so maybe one day she will watch this. And we have these conversations all the time, so she probably, doesn't necessarily need to be here. But I do see some familiar faces like med students. I'm so sorry, you've heard me give this lecture many times. Yes, round 2. So, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. This is something that I lecture about often, usually with medical students, residents, sometimes clinical staff. I get to come in there, and after they've gone through all of their biochemistry and anatomy, I come and don't really talk about medicine whatsoever. I just get to talk to them about like how to really be a kind and respectful person and develop rapport with your patients. So I get really good reviews, but I think that I'm set up for success. So that's where many of these slides come from. So I just wanted to start a little bit and just be really transparent about, I think, some of the limitations that I think that I have standing up here. So I want to be real clear about things that I personally claim and feel like I can speak for. And that's really my lived experience. So I identify as a lesbian. Like 80 mentioned, I have a wonderful wife, and we have 2 children, and I have lots of experiences that come along with that. Both just sort of in all facets of my life. So as a patient, as a doctor, as someone who goes to church, as a family member, all that sort of thing. I have lots and lots of stories and lessons that I've learned from my LGBTQ patients. So right now, my role is really, a large part of my role at work is administrative. So I don't have tons of clinical time, and I have the best practice anybody could imagine. The only patients I actually see are LGBTQ identified patients or their family. So I wrote a letter to everyone who was straight or cisgender, and I told them that I wasn't going to see them anymore. And if they wanted to like go to the lawyers for discrimination, I invited them to do that. Not really, but so my patient panel is awesome because I see tons of transgender people, and I see lots of families of LGBTQ folks also, and I hear really, really good stories all the time. I hear really sad stories too, but so a little bit of what I might talk about has sort of come from some of those stories. And I, of course, have had a lot of formal and a lot of informal training around LGBTQ, primarily health topics, but it's clearly something that I'm quite interested in, so I read a lot about it. So groups that I cannot speak for, I unfortunately cannot speak for the entire LGBTQ community. I know that it would be really nice if I could tell you how everybody felt always and exactly what words to say and not to say, but it's just the reality that I can't. I also can't speak for every lesbian or gay woman everywhere. That's just not something that I can do either. I'll speak from my experience. I do not speak on behalf of Sanctuary Community Church, nor do I speak on behalf of the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics. And I wish I could. I wish I could tell you that I would speak on behalf of all docs, but let me tell you, that is really not true. So I don't speak for any physicians as well. And then just some housekeeping. So a couple of promises. You will not be asked to share any personal stories with others. We're going to have a question and answer period afterwards. We'll have a hopefully helpful self-reflection exercise, but you don't have to share anything. So if you had any fears, please let those be assuaged. There's no expectations for sharing with a larger group. However, for you introverts in the audience, I'm not an introvert, so this doesn't really make any sense to me, but I have good friends who are. And they tell me that it's really anxiety-provoking to like all of a sudden throw it on them, like, go meet a stranger and talk with them about anything. So be thinking of your favorite drink, okay? That question may come up in just a couple of minutes, all right? So there's your little, like, you know, for all the introvert love in the room. So ground rules, so treat everything that we talked about today as an opportunity to learn and grow, even if it's something that might stretch you a little bit, even if it's something that doesn't quite make sense or you don't understand. Please remember to be confidential, so we're being live streamed, recorded. What stays in this room won't just stay in this room, it'll actually be out there on the interwebs, so keep that in mind. And then also, when we're in the question and answer period, I would really ask that you share your experience, not that of others, okay? Anybody have any questions about the ground rules or anything to add? All right, here's our roadmap. We're gonna have an icebreaker. It's gonna take 5 minutes, I estimate. I'm gonna lecture for kind of like 50, 55 minutes probably. We'll have a cool self-reflective exercise. I think it'll take about 10 minutes. You could take that home and spend a lot more time with it, but I would give you about 10 minutes to do it. And then that'll leave us with about 20 minutes of question and answer before we get on the roads and hope that all the snowdrifts have been cleared. All right, so this is our icebreaker exercise. We have two options here. Do you want to drink black coffee, or do you want your coffee with really great Land O'Lakes half and half? Okay? So you're going to turn to a neighbor, so find someone, and it could be in a group of 3 or 4, it doesn't really matter, but just tell people what you prefer to drink. Do you drink your coffee black, or do you drink it with Land O'Lakes half and half? Choices here. I'm really thankful for all the good discussions, but this should, hopefully you've kind of gotten to the answers. Okay, so could I have a raise of hands for everyone who drinks their coffee black? Very nice. Can I have a raise of hands for everybody who drinks their coffee with Land O'Lakes half and half? Okay, all right. Did we get everybody? No. Who did we not get? And how do you guys take your coffee? You don't drink, but you have to drink black coffee or Land O'Lakes green. But you don't drink coffee. You don't even drink coffee. Okay, who else? Yes. You don't drink coffee. What on earth do you drink in the morning then? Tea. Who else? Yes.
I don't drink coffee either.
What do you drink in the morning?
Water.
Novel. Yes. Soy milk. So you can't drink this dairy, this full of dairy. Look at the little Land O'Lakes thing. You don't do that? Soy milk. All right. Who else? Yes. You drink bone broth in the morning. Yeah, that is not one of these options. Okay. All right. So the point is this is just but isn't there just two choices? How do you take your coffee? Black or with cream? Are you straight or are you gay? Are you liberal or conservative? Rich or poor? Are you white or a person of color? Are you a person with a disability or a non-disabled person? Aren't there only two choices? And similarly, aren't there two choices? Are you male or are you female? When you go to the restroom, you only have two choices, right? You go left or you go right. Isn't it just that simple? So if we can't even decide what we want to drink in the morning, then I think that we can probably understand that the complexity of the human body and the complexity of our minds and gender might be a little bit more complicated than that as well. So our objectives for today are this is like a good terms and definitions type of lecture. So we're going to talk some terminology and concepts related to LGBTQ identities. And then we'll talk some about kind of a nuanced relationship between behavior, identity, and attraction. And then finally, we'll kind of end with some hopefully practical tips and tricks about becoming a better ally. So things that I will not address today. And so David was super awesome because he sent out, I think when people RSVP'd that they got to maybe ask some questions or something. And so as I read through that and tried to address most of the questions that maybe you folks, or maybe the folks who are going to come at the Polar Vortex had asked, but some folks did ask some specific questions about theology, and that is not something that I'm going to address today. It's been done very well by lots of other folks. This is just kind of a sample of a reading list. This is included as well as a resource list that you guys can have access to. We'll put on the website. My favorite book out of all of these probably is David Gushie's book, Changing Our Mind. Succinct, well done, I really, really like it. Torn by Justin Lee is one of my other favorites. And then if you guys are on social media and you would like to follow some folks on Twitter that are specifically interesting, and some trans folks that are usually serving as pastors of churches, then those three at the bottom are going to be some ones that'd be cool to follow. All right, so as we talk about terms and definitions, I want us to keep a couple of things in mind. And to do this really well, I always think about when we started the LGBTQ clinic. So my co-director is a wonderful woman named Nicole Nisley. She's a general internal medicine doc. And in 2011 and 2012, as we were preparing to open the LGBTQ clinic, one of the things that we together did was we had the privilege of having some focus group sessions with members of the LGBTQ community in Iowa City, specifically a lot of transgender folks. So there were some students from the university, however, many of them weren't students, they were just community members. And it was really enlightening just to learn how important that language is. So even though I identify as a lesbian, doesn't mean that I really knew anything about transgender or gender issues. And so I of course had the privilege, just like most of us do, that we just don't necessarily think about language that much. We don't have to think about pronouns. We don't have to think about people misgendering us. And yet that is something that is just so very, very practical that we can do as we interact with folks that make a huge difference. So, and then the last thing about that is just that we can take responsibility. You guys are taking lots of responsibility here. We sometimes expect people that are in marginalized groups to be the ones to teach us. And if we go out of our way and sort of try to get a little bit of background knowledge and approach it from an aspect of not just here I am, teach me, but I've read about this and I really have some questions and let's engage, it really will go a little bit better. So thank you for being here, and I hope that this just kind of is the start of more conversation for you. All right, now we're gonna get into the language. So I am a family doctor and I get to deliver babies. It's one of the most favorite parts of my job, when it doesn't last for 36 hours, and I've been in the hospital for a long time. But anyhow, rarely, but sometimes the parents don't have an ultrasound at 20 weeks and determine what the sex of the baby is. And so it's a surprise. It's like my favorite thing. So I'm gonna deliver a baby and we don't know what the sex is. And so I, as the doctor, get to assign the sex at birth, right? And it's not because I grab an ultrasound and look for their gonads, and it's not because I do a cheek swab and figure out what their karyotype is. I just look at their external genitalia and I assign that baby a sex at birth, either male or female. So of course, sometimes we have babies that are born with ambiguous genitalia, or sometimes we have women or children who are going through puberty and it doesn't happen as expected, or we have someone who in the midst of a workup for infertility, and we determine that that person is what we would call intersex. So old word for that would be something like hermaphrodite. Newer, more acceptable word, intersex. Another way would be DSD, differences in sex development. So even if we have an infant that's born with ambiguous genitalia, by the time that that baby leaves the hospital, we have assigned them a sex at birth, either male or female, okay? So really, in med school and things like this, I mean, what I used to think of as just the word sex, I now really sort of think of it as sex assigned at birth, okay? So we're talking about chromosomes, reproductive organs, hormones, all that sort of stuff. And to contrast that, then we have gender. And many folks just think that those are one and the same. That you could have, you might, I don't know, where do you go where you have like a paper form now, like a paper form with a line? Not UIHC usually, but if you go to like the dentist maybe, you have to it says like name, and then it would say sex with a line or gender, and we might think that that's one or the same. But I really want to challenge us to think about how different sex assigned at birth is from gender. When we think of gender, you can break that down into a couple of different ways. So one is gender expression. All of us today and tonight, this evening, made decisions about our gender expression. What clothes were we going to wear? Were we going to wear makeup or jewelry? Were we going to shave our beard or leave it nice and full? These are all decisions that we make every day to talk about how do we want to express our gender. And they may be very different. They may be very different when you are at work than when you are at home, or if it's a Tuesday versus a Saturday, or if you're going here versus going there. So we can express our gender differently depending on the situation, or how we feel, or lots of things. The other thing is gender norms. So when I'm typically talking to medical people, I'll ask the room, who has ever been so I'll ask the room of, let's say, physicians, who has ever been asked to, nurse, will you please go get this for me? And hardly ever do I have a man raise his hand and say, oh yes, people mistake me for a nurse all the time, right? No, it's the women in the room who are mistaken for nurses. And, in the same ways that we can look at a show like Mad Men and sort of think of, wow, look at those really strict gender norms and those gender roles. So this is really what society sort of places in an expectation about how people will present themselves and what their roles will be in society. So those are the gender norms that we would talk about. And then we have gender identity, and that's not what society places upon a person. It really comes from each individual person. And it is their own sense of being a gender being. Okay? So gender identity is going to be the big term here that we're going to hear over and over. And then I have two terms here on the right. Has anybody taken organic chemistry? Yes. I was like such a nerd. I got these real little hold in your hand to manipulate. What are they? Are they molecules? I don't even know anymore. Don't tell anybody. So, and they're like atoms, and you can move them all around and things like this. So this is really what this is trying to imply, just that these are Latin terms. So if we're going to say something trans, meaning opposite sides, then we can say what the Latin term is for same side, and that would be cis. So this is how we get terms like cisgender and transgender. So we can have people who are cisgender man or a cisgender woman. We can have a trans man, a trans woman, and non-binary. So for somebody to be cisgender, it just means that they have the same side. So their sex assigned at birth aligns along the same side as their gender identity. And the opposite of that would be someone who's transgender. Their sex assigned at birth does not align with their gender identity. So I have a word here, trans, with an asterisk. And while it doesn't roll off of the tongue, it is very nice when it's written because it implies that we have a base term, trans, that has an umbrella sort of around it and encompasses a lot of other terms. So if you ever do like a search in some sort of an index and you put a base term with an asterisk, then you would get all of the results that were related to that base term. So these are folks that, again, have this incongruity, so this misalignment between their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity. So they usually don't conform to what society or the culture that they're in would expect for how they present, for maybe the roles that they have in society, their gender norms, or their identity. And I have a couple really cool slides on here from a very cool site called, it's pronounced Metrosexual, and this is one of those slides. So, and this one just sort of kind of is a representation of what that sort of trans umbrella would encompass. So transgender, trans man, trans woman, gender queer, agender, transsexual, two-spirit, gender fluid, non-binary, gender non-conforming, bigender, third gender, trans-masculine, trans-feminine, androgynous. So Facebook has 47 gender options, okay? So male and female being 2, and then there's 45 others, and the majority of those are gonna, of course, fall under this trans umbrella, a lot of them being in this non-binary category that we're gonna talk about in just a sec. What I wanted to do briefly though, I know it's not a medical lecture, but I do think that sometimes it's just, it can help us just understand what does it mean. I think, and maybe this is really my bias, but I think that it also can potentially give some validity just to folks who have gender dysphoria as well. So the DSM-5, it's like the psychiatric Bible. So it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And so the DSM, so the 5th edition came out in 2013. Prior to that, there was the 4th, and then the 3rd, and all that sort of stuff. And so what in the 4th edition and those preceding was called gender identity disorder, they changed it to something called gender dysphoria in an attempt to be less pathologizing. So to take out the word disorder and make it seem like, oh goodness, like what a psychiatric illness, and try to make it sound a little, less problematic or disordered, if you would, and call it gender dysphoria. So you have to have two criteria. The first one, you have an incongruence between your experienced gender and your assigned gender, so just like we've talked about. And then this can't be something that you've decided because you watched a really awesome documentary on Netflix, and now you've listened to a couple podcasts, and you're like, yeah, like that's totally it. Now, 6 months or longer, so persistent, insistent, consistent, okay? And this is just for adults. They have similar but a little bit different stuff for kids. We're just gonna talk about the adults just because we could dive into that, and it's just gonna take a little bit more time. So you need 2 of the 6 indicators. And these are things that you would expect. So you have an incongruence between one's experienced gender and primary under secondary sex characteristics, okay? So you want to be rid of the sex characteristics that you have, and you want to have the sex characteristics of the other gender. You have a strong desire to be the other gender, to be treated as such, and convictions that you have the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender. So you need 2 of 6 of these for 6 months or longer. And then importantly, you have criterion B, which means that you have distress or impairment in social and occupational functioning, increased stress, disability, or suffering. Okay, so this is where the dysphoria part of it comes in. And importantly, when they updated to the DSM-5, they included this statement, which I like so much that I just read it verbatim. So gender nonconformity, so that just means like not presenting as you would expect or not identifying with the sex that you were assigned at birth. So gender nonconformity is not in itself a mental disorder. The critical element of gender dysphoria is the presence of clinically significant distress associated with the condition. So what they tried to do here was essentially really depathologize the whole thing, saying trans people, people who have gender non-conforming behaviors, whatever that would be, they are not inherently disordered. They are not inherently, to be pathologized, but they potentially have distress and suffering and disability associated with this. And that is what gives them the diagnosis, and that is what we treat. And that is what I treat with lots of hormones, or I refer them for surgical procedures so that they can align their body externally with how they feel internally to try to consolidate their gender and improve their dysphoria. So a little bit back to some additional terms. And what I have here is transsexual with a line through it, and then transgender. This is just saying, truly, either one is right. And transsexual in its truest sense means that you have a transgender person who has this incongruence and who wants to take medical steps to actually physically transition their gender. What I would tell you though is that there are many folks who don't identify with the term transsexual. They think it's overly pathologizing. They think it's a bit of a misnomer because it's really talking about sex and they're really talking about their gender. Long story short, I think the safer term is just transgender. So that's what I would use. Many people feel like it means the same thing. Transgender people can also take medical steps, be it hormones and or surgeries. And so I think that many people may be familiar with terms like female to male, or maybe you've seen it written like, FTM, or male to female, or MTF. And I would encourage you to try to incorporate words like trans man and trans woman. And I know that it's not as easy. That when you get to say like female to male, everybody can like have the picture of that in their mind. Like we're starting here with a female, we're going to male, and it's a little bit easier. What I would tell you though is like it's really not that hard. Okay, here's the trick. So you say something like trans man, and in your mind you're saying like transitioning to man. And you're saying the gender that affirms their identity, okay? So, and the reason that I like those terms a little bit better is because I think that when we say something like female to male, it implies a whole bunch of stuff. We make all these assumptions. We make the assumptions that okay, so we have somebody who's starting as a female, so they have breasts, they have a vagina, and they look a certain way and act a certain way, and they are going all the way to male. And our expectation in our society is that now they're going to get rid of their breasts and have a male chest. They're going to get rid of their vagina, they're going to have a penis, and they're going to act a certain way, and it's probably like G.I. Joe, right? Like that is what our expectation is, and that's just not true. So it doesn't allow for the diversity within the community, which means that I have trans people who don't need to take any hormones to treat their dysphoria. Maybe they just want to change their name, maybe they want to change their pronouns, they want to maybe change the way that they dress and present, but they don't need anything else. It doesn't make them any more or less trans than another one of my patients who needs to have surgery and hormones and all these other things to treat their dysphoria. So by kind of saying this male to female, it really paints this picture that just isn't necessarily true. So trans man is just a little bit more of an inclusive type term, as is trans woman. So the term transition is this process. It is a physical, spiritual, emotional, social process of moving from one gender to another. And many people may not identify as trans after they have transitioned to their affirmed gender. This is not necessarily a surprise to us, but it's something that we're able to keep track of in the LGBTQ clinic. So when you come to see me or Dr. Knisley or any of our partners, you get a nice little iPad and you get to answer a bunch of questions. And so we ask people, what is your sex assigned at birth? And then we ask them, what is your gender? And so we have a lot of options. You can say, my gender is man or woman or trans woman or non-binary. And we are really surprised by how many people don't choose trans man or trans woman. They say, my gender is man or woman. And if all that we asked was just, what is your gender, we'd miss them, right? Not necessarily so important for you all, but super important when we think about how much research do we have on trans people in the medical field? Hardly any. How do we do research if we don't actually know who they are? Like, we need to be able to collect the data in a way that we can actually go back and say, like, let's figure out with all of our trans patients whatever the outcome is. And so being really careful with how we're asking these questions is really important. So it's kind of two questions. What's your sex assigned at birth? What's your gender? And if they don't match, then we throw them under the trans umbrella. And so then some of you might have heard terms like pre-op or post-op. And again, I would say that these terms are sort of outdated, should be avoided. It's kind of implying that everyone wants to be post-op. So if you have, someone who is like, oh, well, they're, and probably if people aren't medical, you're probably not talking about this tons and tons, but it happens all the time in the medical field, right? Like if you say, oh, well, I have a pre-op transgender patient, it's sort of implying that everyone needs or wants to have this surgery. And again, it's just not the reality. So we've really talked about kind of these binary options here, these trans men, trans women, and now I do want to talk just a little bit about non-binary people. So these are folks who reject the binary gender, and these are a lot of our Facebook options here, okay? And so this is just a sampling. So non-binary, again, is this umbrella term. Within that, we have these specific terms like gender queer, third gender, androgynous, gender fluid, agender. I could go on and on and on. I actually learn new ones all the time. I ask my patients, because I ask them, well, is there any specific term or word that you use to identify your gender? And they'll tell me all of these really great things. And I'll say, wow.
Mean the same thing, or they all mean?
They do not all mean the same thing. I think that one of the most awesome questions to ask is like, what does it mean to those people? So, but they would mean slightly different things. So for one, like, let's just talk about something like third gender. So somebody who's third gender really feels like they might be that there should be this third gender option. You have man, you have woman, and then they would be a third gender option. Somebody who's gender fluid might feel like they have fluidity on, day to day or week to week or whatever that might be. It might not be necessarily saying like, they identify as a man to a woman, but they may just feel like some days they want to present more masculine and some days more feminine. So that would be somebody who would be gender fluid. Somebody who is androgynous is super, super happy walking around and having people say like, is that a guy or is that a girl? Perfect. They did what they were hoping. They are androgynous. They hope that you look at them and kind of think that they may be trans. They would like that, okay? And so similar to how we may not have just these two options, man or woman, we also, for non-binary people, they may use kind of non-binary pronouns. So instead of just she or he, they would use pronouns like they, them, theirs, z, zers, ze, here, heres. How do you know? It's simple. You ask them what their pronouns are. That's the only way to really know, okay? They, I think, was like the Merriam-Webster Dictionary Word of the Year last year. So it's becoming like more and more common to actually see they. Grammar teachers everywhere are rolling over in their grave using a plural pronoun about a singular person. But they is actually really quite effective because it does sound pretty darn natural. When you don't know what someone's pronoun is, you can just say they and no one really blinks an eye. I'll kind of talk about that at the end. I would encourage us all to sort of try that. So I really try hard to document in my medical records, all of my nurses. We know how important that it is to use proper pronouns. So pronouns are easy when you're talking to someone because you don't pronoun them when you're talking to them, but you pronoun when you're talking about them. So if you're having like a triangulated conversation, then you're gonna have to know pronouns. Or and when I often lecture to folks, I think that we get to the pronoun part and where I just kind of see some people like shake their heads, like, really? Like, but you really need me to like write this in the medical chart or use these pronouns? Like, I think he or she, and maybe if I use the name that they want, like that should be good enough. And I think about this story that, back right after our clinic started, there was a group that I was a part of, and it was looking at how our services in Iowa City to support survivors of sexual assault, how they did around caring for folks in the trans community. And so I was, at the Iowa City Public Library for one whole day or something, and we broke into some small groups, and when we brought it back to the center, one of the groups had a whiteboard, and they had drawn on there the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics, and they drew like a barbed wire fence around it. And they said, this is how we feel, thinking about accessing care at UIHC. We know that we are going to be misgendered, that people are going to ignore what we look at, what we look like, and call us, and not even ask what our pronouns are, not even ask what we want to be called. We know that our experience is going to be awful. And I continually kind of come back to that and just think about how we had just done a disservice to this community and this population. And if all it took was to actually use someone's pronoun, and this is one thing that they actually feel like they have agency over, right? So we're talking about people whose body is like betraying themselves. And if we can give them a little bit of agency just by using words that they feel really describes them, I think that I'm all for that, okay? So that's how I feel about pronouns. They're super important. And so they take a lot of practice. So they take a lot of practice. So Emily said that we can pick them up around 7 o'clock. They're really excited for this movie. I can't wait to talk to them about it afterwards and hear their perspective. Okay, so this is they and theirs. Jordan said that we can pick Zira up around 7 o'clock because he's really excited for this movie. I can't wait to talk to Zira about it and hear Zira's perspective. Takes practice. It helps to do it in front of a mirror. Set your teddy bears up, right? Triangulate your conversations. All right. So we've talked a lot about gender. We're going to talk a little bit about sexuality. But don't forget what you just learned about gender because it is our point of reference. So what does that mean? Like, sexuality is about... So sexuality is sort of about two people, or at least. And so we need this point of reference, which is our kind of like index person's gender, to then talk about what their sexuality is. So we have a lot of words for sexuality, and I'm not going to belabor all of these because I think that we're more familiar with some of these, but I will talk about just a couple. So one would be like aromantic, or aro is sort of how you might hear, at least I hear a lot of my younger kids identify as that, aro, or asexual, or ace. And so these are people who do not feel like they have romantic attractions to other folks in terms of aromantic. Asexual folks might feel like they have romantic relationships and they want maybe a companion, but they don't necessarily want to be sexually intimate with someone. Demisexual is someone who feels like they cannot have a sexual experience unless they feel very emotionally connected to that person. That would be a demisexual, like your anti-one-night stander, if you may. Then you have pansexual, or someone who is pan. And so pan, I think of as like it's 2019 now, huh? So like the 2019 bisexual. So it's somebody who doesn't necessarily limit like their Match.com options based on gender. So it might be someone who is a cis man or a cis woman or a trans man or a trans woman or a non-binary person. It's kind of irrespective of gender. They fall in love with perhaps this person, or they would feel open to having a relationship with someone of any gender. The word queer in its truest sense could just replace all the letters. So instead of LGBTQ or instead of LGBT, we could just say queer. So queer is this umbrella term that means anyone who is a sexual or gender minority. And the reason that, at least in our case for our clinic, that we don't just call ourselves the queer clinic, we have kind of two Qs, queer and questioning, is because there are still some people who feel like that term is super derogatory. And it was used in that way for a really long time. The younger generation has done a really nice job of actually reclaiming that term and used it quite positively. So, but it doesn't work for everybody. I always think that it's best to kind of echo the language back that people use. So you're gonna like leave this lecture, you're gonna feel super proud of yourself, and you're gonna find your first gay person and want to talk to them about it and be like super hip. Don't start off and just say like, so how's the queer community being treated, right? Like it may fall flat, you might fall flat on your face there. And it might go over fine, but again, just echo the terms that they use back to you, because then you sort of have a sense for what they're comfortable with. And then we have a lot of behavior terms. Again, this is really sort of more so medical stuff, but if you ever see these, MSM is men who have sex with men, WSW, women who have sex with women, WSWM, women who have sex with women and men, and then we have trans people. There's just too many moving parts to have 3 letters, right? I always say, like, you need to realize, figure out what parts does your patient have, what body parts does their partner have, and how do they put those body parts together. We don't have 3 letters that can describe that. So, who has seen Coyote Ugly? This is probably when I really knew that I was a lesbian. Maria Bello. It was 2000. I think I knew way before that, actually. I had already been dating my wife for 2 years, so. but it cemented the idea for me. So, Maria Bello, she was the bar owner. She always wore tank tops. But so she wrote a modern love column in the New York Times in 2013, and it was lovely. She had a 12-year-old son from a relationship that she had with a man, and she kind of details essentially falling in love with her best friend, who was a woman, and starting a relationship with her. And so part of this is her son actually asking her and her kind of coming out to him and telling him this story. And her whole point of her essay is that she doesn't necessarily like identify as anything. So her son says to her, "Mom, love is love, whatever you are." And so she says, "So I'd like to consider myself a whatever." Okay? And so it's beautiful. She's since broken up with her partner, and I think she's dating some really young man. Last time I checked BuzzFeed. So there you have it. So we've defined LGBTQ here, and I'm going to give you the colors of the rainbow in case you forget, because it's really important. Roy G. Biv, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, okay? So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and then questioning. Questioning we really didn't go over, but that's just anybody who's sort of questioning either their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So while we do sort of have this LGBTQ acronym, and while we talked a lot about gender, we talked about sexual orientation, I think that an important point to make is that sexual orientation and gender identity are really 2 separate things, okay? So just because you know what someone's gender identity is doesn't mean that you know what their sexual orientation is. Or just because you know what their sexual orientation is doesn't mean that you know what their gender is. So for instance, you could have someone who is a transgender woman, and she may identify as a lesbian, or she may be straight, or bisexual, or pansexual, or anything down that whole column, right? So yes, it's all one community, and sure it's related, but those 2 things don't predict each other. Everybody clear about that? Then I want to talk really quickly about sexual identity and sort of what makes that up. And so when I talk about kind of sexual identity, I'm really speaking about like how some person or one person would identify in terms of their sexuality. So if they were asked on a survey that they would put into a box, no one would open and know that their name was tied to it. Like what in their heart of hearts, how do they identify? That I think is made up of some different things. And so these are the things that it's made up of. And so our assumption, of course, is that we usually just look at their relationship. And we say, oh, well here's a woman, and she's married to a man, and so clearly, I got it all figured out, right? Like I know that her desire is to be with only her husband. Her behavior is only with her husband in the bedroom, in a certain position. That is it, right? And then her orientation is that she's a straight woman. Like, you got it figured out, right? And the reality is that those things may not all line up. Those things, like, we can't figure that out just by someone's relationship. We are way more complex than that. As a family doctor, this is like one of my very favorite things because I love holistic, comprehensive care, and I love really knowing my patients. And I think that this part of it is like so important. That even if you have somebody who says, my identity is a straight man, I only have sex with my wife, and yet if you really ask them what their desire is, you may get a whole different answer and really sort of get into some real issues that might have a lot of effects on their health. So that's what I'm really trying to get here to point out here. It's just that it's a lot more complex than what we see on the surface. And I think that this gets us to, it's a nice segue just to this topic of bisexual invisibility or erasure. So, and of course you could see how this could happen. So if we, as a society, oftentimes just look at someone's relationship and then we presume all of these other things about their orientation and about their desire and their behavior, then we may miss a lot of bisexual people. And that goes both ways. So we may miss folks who are in a heterosexual relationship that are bisexual, and we may miss people who are in a same-sex relationship who identify as bisexual. We could probably throw pansexual into this conversation also too, right? So bisexual and or pansexual. And so some of the things that come up is that there's a denial of existence or legitimacy, that it's not a real thing, it's just a phase, it's just kind of that phase in your coming out journey. I'll be real honest, it was a lot easier to tell my parents that I was bisexual before I was gay. I don't know that I was ever really bisexual, but sure, for a couple months I said that I was. And that these folks just feel like they don't fit anywhere. So they don't necessarily fit in the straight community, they don't necessarily fit in the LGBTQ community. They feel like you're not one of us. So they're often stereotyped as being really hypersexual, like they want their cake and they want to eat it too, non-monogamous, all of these types of things. And bisexual people do, there's lots of them. So this is the largest self-identified sexual minority group within the US, and they have disparate health outcomes as compared to straight and lesbian and gay people. So in terms of mental health, intimate partner violence, substance use, and we have a lack of funding or dedicated services or even knowledge or competency out there in the health profession around this. So I think it's really important to kind of keep that in mind, that it's not like all the colors of the rainbow necessarily get along hunky-dory all the time. That's just not the reality. So we have a similar situation, I think, with transphobia even within the LGB community. And so some of the ways that this has played out over history is when we think about the Stonewall riots in 1969, kind of the inception of the modern gay rights movement. You know, we often hear about all these gay men, but the reality is that we're ignoring the fact that many of these, you know, first warriors were trans women of color. So Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, these were some of the real heroes of Stonewall, and they were trans women, okay? And there's been some exclusionary practices or spaces, even within the LGBT community. Michigan Women's Fest was this giant music festival, and they had a lot of things that it was kind of like women, you know, like female-bodied persons only. So they were exclusionary for trans women. There's been, of course, a giant push, successfully so. Like LGBTQ rights has really made some progress, and a lot of it has been on the backs of marriage equality, which doesn't necessarily mean as much to trans folks as it does to some lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. and that there's been this sense that trans people have been thrown under the bus, or that some of their rights have been sacrificed as we've tried to have some overall gains for LGBT people. So I'm going to shift now just to kind of get to more of the practical side of the talk as we finish up here. And so some real tips about sort of language and how you can potentially say things. So we've talked about many of these, and I know that this is a little bit small, so I apologize, but instead of saying things like hermaphrodite, we talked about saying words like intersex. We didn't talk about this one yet, but I'd love to. So the word homosexual. So homosexuality was in that DSM, that psychiatric Bible, up until through the third edition. So in 1973 was actually when it was taken out of the DSM. It was a psychiatric illness. So I do not identify as a homosexual. I identify as gay, I identify as lesbian. When I hear the term homosexual, I usually see people standing at pulpits much like this, right? Or on stumps, if they're a politician, talking about it in a super derogatory way. So that's what I think of when I hear the term homosexual. Some people do identify with that term. I, again, cannot speak for every LGBTQ person or every gay or lesbian person. So some people do. This is not a blanket statement. I'm just saying that most of the folks that I would say do not necessarily identify with the term homosexual. Born female or born male or female-bodied or male-bodied. Instead, you can use that assigned sex at birth. So assigned female at birth, assigned male at birth. So usually this like, it's just more true as to what it is. Instead of saying things like a gay or a transgender, look over there, I found a gay or a transgender. You know, it's not like a noun by itself, it's actually an adjective that describes a group or a person. So we had a transgender athlete, right? And then similarly, I would also say that transgendered with an ED, I'm not gayed or lesbian, I am just a lesbian. So you would just say transgender, like a transgender person. So instead of saying transgender people and normal people, or a trans man and a real man, or one of those is clearly abnormal, we again have these really great Latin terms, and we can just say a trans man or a cis man. Like, those are equal playing field opposites of each other, right? So instead of saying both genders or opposite sexes, we can take into account our non-binary friends and say things like all genders. Instead of ladies and gentlemen, we can use some really, really novel language like folks, everyone, honored guests, whatever that it might be. And similarly, where we gender lots of things, mailman, fireman, policeman, you know, we have some gender-inclusive terms for those that we can use. And then instead of using it when referring to someone when you don't know what their pronouns are, you just use they. So, you know, I'm not sure how they identify. Like, it just rolls off the tongue. It really does, really does. So you can use they to talk about one person, and it really is pretty easy. Okay, so a couple tips and tricks for talking to humans. So newsflash, your gaydar is not 100%. All right, so even if you kind of had me pegged before you walked in, that's like a really low bar. Okay, so we just can't like turn it on and turn it off. Like, everything that I've talked about here and everything I'm going to talk about, I'm encouraging you to just like assimilate into the way you talk to people, not just to those people who you think are gay. Like, oh, got him, a gay, there's a gay, I'm gonna turn it on now, right? No, like, we are just not that good. I think I'm especially good. But, you know, my gaydar is probably not 100% either. All right, so instead of asking, like, do you have a boyfriend or do you have a husband? Or instead of asking, do you have a girlfriend or do you have a wife? You could ask things like, do you have a partner or do you have a spouse? Are you currently in a relationship? So real, like, gender-inclusive terms here. If yes, great, tell me about it. Like, and they probably are going to, somewhere in that conversation, tell you about either with a pronoun or a name or something, about something that gives you some idea about potentially how you would like to refer to their partner in the future. So again, avoid assumptions. So recognize that we are like steeped in heterocentric, just society and culture, and the same thing, cis-centric society and culture, and so those beliefs and privilege that come with that, right? Like, I have 2 children, and I have a wife, and they at one point in time looked at me and said, what? kids. And I thought, oh my gosh, like what have we done? We have failed them. Like of course this kid can have two dads, right? So like it's just because they live in the world. And the world is really mostly heterosexual and cisgender. So remember that relationship status does not equal identity. It's way more complex than that. And orientation may or may not equal behavior and may or may not equal attraction. So listen to the language that the person uses and echo it back to them. Many of my friends, and I included, do use terms like wife or husband, but many of my friends don't also. So they may not identify with their same-sex partner as their wife. They may like to use terms more so like partner or spouse. Ask them is a really fine way. Listen to what they use, echo it back to them. The word queer is, like I said, one that works a lot for some people and may not work for others. So listen and see if they say it to you. The same thing there with lesbian or gay. So talking with trans people, importantly, ask what their preferred name is. So I like to use like the reasonable person, sort of, like, are you a reasonable person? Do you look at this person and say like, wow, like this person looks like, so in a medical setting, you know, you have a medical chart and it says like Michael, and then the person comes in and has a dress and high heels and lipstick on. And so you being a reasonable person might think like, wow, I'm gonna ask that person what their name is and what their pronouns are. Because I'm thinking like maybe that they're not Michael, they're a little bit gender non-conforming. So I think that in the same way, it's just always really good practice to like put your reasonable person hat on and think about like, when are those times where I might wanna ask somebody what their gender pronouns are. When they tell you, you should honor those names and honor those pronouns. And if you make a mistake, which you will, don't just act like, well, they've probably, you know, had people call them by the wrong pronouns like 10 times already today. Like, own that mistake, apologize, move on. So just a couple trans-specific words to know and to try to avoid doing or saying. So one is dead naming, and this is the process of using the name of a transgender person which they kind of use prior to transitioning. So this would often be like their given name or their birth name. Do not do that, okay? So dead naming is like the term for that. Use the name that they use currently. So clocked or red, so this would often be like a trans person talking about they went to the supermarket and they were clocked or they were red, which means that they were trying to present the gender that they identify with, and somebody read them or clocked them as being trans. Misgendering means using words like ma'am or sir or Mr. or Mrs. and kind of misgendering that person. This is one of the things that when I talk to my patients about, you know, what do you still have any gender dysphoria? And they'll often tell me like, I'm pretty darn good until I go into the world and then I get misgendered. And then my gender dysphoria really, really just cranks up, okay? Transgenderism is a word that's largely used by sort of anti-transgender activists to dehumanize people and reduce who they are to, again, kind of a condition. So that term in itself, transgenderism, isn't one that I would use. So we're going to talk a little bit about coming out and what that is. So this is like a gift. This is the willingness of one person to share their gender identity and or their sexuality with another person. It's a personal decision. It's oftentimes a journey. It happens again, and then it happens again, and again, and like forever and ever and ever, right? And it may change for that person depending on their environment or their company. So for instance, like I was really out in all aspects of my life until I was in an exam room with a patient. And then I felt much less comfortable actually kind of answering that question when I was pregnant. And patients would ask me all the time, what does your husband do? And I would have to like instantly make a decision like, okay, does that person have like what is their background? Do they have a cross on their necklace? Like, how should I answer this question? Do I just say, my husband is a teacher, and then go home and tell Paula like, wow, I'm so sorry, you were a guy again today when my patient asked me, or do I then say like, oh, actually I have a partner and she's a teacher. So like, it can change depending on your company and the environment. And again, if somebody comes out to you, this is a gift that they have given to you. It is to be respected, honored, and never shared. It is their gift to share. So if someone comes out to you, these are a couple things not to do. Don't say, I always knew, just waiting for you to tell me, right? Don't go bragging to everybody about your new trans friend or your new gay friend, whatever that it is. Don't forget that they are still the person that you loved and knew before. Don't ask probing questions or cross personal barriers you wouldn't have crossed earlier. So if you don't ask like your cisgender friends about their genitals, don't ask your trans friends about their genitals, right? Don't assume that you know why they came out to you or what necessarily is behind it. So do know that this is a sign that they trust you. Do know to check in on how confidential that this is. That's a really good question to ask. Like, just ask them, like, do other people know? Who does know? Is it a secret? You know, kind of try to figure out just how confidential that you may need to be about it, or where they are, what kind of support that they may need. Remember that their gender and sexuality is one dimension of many of them, and show interest and curiosity about this part and what they're sharing with you, and ask them how you can best support them. So a couple tips and tricks for being a good ally. So some of these are just like, you know, being at this seminar and then talking to other folks about it, right? So like talking to straight people and cisgender people about the fact that you are interested in LGBTQ plus issues, or that you have LGBTQ plus friends, family, whatever that it is, and talking about some of the specific issues that they may face. You can intentionally create diverse social gatherings to try to get those people kind of into one setting, assuming that you can ensure safety. So probably not the best idea to, you know, like have your really, really right-leaning uncle over for dinner and then bring, you know, your like newfound trans friend. Like that may not be the best idea, but you can imagine that there would be some situations that might go better than that. So if you hear something that is an anti-LGBTQ joke or statement or policy, don't be silent about it, right? So silence is often meaning that you are complicit. So say something. If something says like, that is so gay, you could probably give them 1,000 other words that they could use if they really meant stupid. So attend pride celebrations or other LGBTQ themed events. Find a visible marker of support. Lots of those options: a t-shirt, a bumper sticker, a coffee mug, whatever that it might be. And that is all right now for my lecture. We are going to dive into an exercise and do questions and answers at the end. But before, though, I do want to, so David, if you want to hand those out super fast, there are some terms and definitions on here that I want folks to make sure that they feel comfortable with. And so I'll take a couple questions just about that before we get started. So this is the genderbread person. This is again from the website called, it's pronounced Metrosexual. Full disclaimer, this website is great. It is created by a cisgender heterosexual man, and he has come under some controversy because of that. He is cisgender and heterosexual. He's written a book. He's made a lot of money, and there are some trans folks and LGBTQ identified folks who feel like he doesn't necessarily have a leg to stand on. I like his stuff. It is not copyrighted. It is all free. So a little bit of controversy, just in full transparency. So the genderbread person is one thing that he's come up with that I love. So it essentially is talking about that we can think of all these things as continuum. So thinking back to our first question, like, do you want your coffee black or with cream? If there's not just two options, if there's a continuum, then we can potentially see ourselves somewhere between that, 0 to 100, whatever that you kind of put those numbers in there, in between it. And so when you look at the genderbread person, kind of that, just the little guy, you know, the little person, is just kind of talking about what we've already gone through. So we have your identity, which is kind of pointing to your brain, your attraction, pointing to your heart, your expression is kind of meant to show, like, you know, what clothes that this person wears or how they present themselves, and then sex, meaning kind of those biological organs or hormones, secondary sex characteristics, all of those types of things. And so what I want you to do is think about all of these things and kind of put yourselves, so we have 10 minutes, so put yourselves on this continuum. And so for womanness and manness, femininity, masculinity, maleness, femaleness, you know, all the way to the left, there's like this little empty set kind of thing. So that would be like 0, and all the way to the right then would be 100. And so you might be 0 for womanness and 100 for manness, or any of those types of things. And I want to kind of challenge you just to think about how we've learned all these terms. And one thing specifically, so for something like anatomical sex, I want you to kind of have an expansive view of this. So, you know, there are some women who might be 6'3" and might have really big feet and really big hands, and those are kind of masculine traits, right? And so I think that anatomical sex can mean a whole lot of different things. Like, what is your breast size? Are you that one of those women who might have something like polycystic ovarian syndrome and have a little bit of like more male pattern hair than someone else? These are all secondary sex characteristics that mean that you're probably not all the way at one end and all the way at the other end. There's a lot of grayness there, okay? And then we have some things on the bottom here. So then we have sex assigned at birth, female, intersex or male, and then sexually attracted to women or female people, feminine, men, masculinity, male people, and then lifetime sexually or romantically intimate with. So we're gonna kind of really try to, you know, make it in the lifetime, not just your current partner, but think about sort of throughout your whole lifespan here. And one thing that I would say too is with the sexually attracted to, really think of this in pretty broad terms too. So, you know, like sexually, emotionally, intimately, flirting, dating, all of those things, not just necessarily like who you ended up being sexually intimate with. Make sense? Questions about any of those terms or definitions? Cool. Let's take 7 minutes and do it. All right, does anybody need some more time? Let's say 30 more seconds. All right, cool. What do you guys think? Was it easier or harder than you expected? A little bit harder. I always find it hard too. And I do this like 4 times a year with med students, and I find that if you don't take it at face value, but if you really sort of dive in and think about it, that it is a little bit harder than you would expect. So hopefully you might have learned a little bit of something about yourself, at least learned some terms and definitions, but I would encourage you to take it home, think more about it, share it with others. You can find the website on there, print it off. It's not copyrighted again, but I think it's a helpful exercise. So just a couple take-home points for tonight. We defined LGBTQ there. Relationship status, important to remember that it doesn't always predict sexual identity. Sexual orientation is referenced from, right? So point of reference, so it's separate to one's gender identity. And then being an ally requires, I think, some honest self-reflection about ourselves and a commitment to listening. And that is it. I have some resources at the end that we'll put on the website, but I did want to just open it up for about 20 minutes of questioning. So David, I think, has a microphone, but again, I'm happy to talk about anything. Please try to share your own experiences, and just be mindful that this is being broadcast and not just staying in this room tonight.
So one thing you mentioned was when you were going over terms, you said when you talk about transgender, you should also acknowledge that cisgender is the other term.
Yep.
And I think that that's something I think a lot of us need to start using more. I'm wondering if that's what you're saying. Like, we're so inclined to label the people that aren't cisgender.
Yeah.
And cisgender is not really picking up
Right.
as much as I think it should, because it would help everyone realize, like, look, cisgenders, being straight is a thing.
Yeah, no, that's a good
Just
point.
like being gay is a thing. So you can't just act like there's everything else, and then there's straight people.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I would agree with you that I think that when I give these talks that many folks hadn't heard the word cisgender. Was there anybody here who had never heard the term cisgender tonight? Yeah, so, but it's for sure becoming more common within the community, which is of course where it has to start, right? So oftentimes we refer to people as, I think, cisgender or cis, like, are they trans or are they cis? So I would encourage all of you, and I think that we can talk about this with lots of things, like race, right? Like, we always talk about the black dude, but never like the white dude. It's just the dude, or it's the black dude. So, it's not unique in that, I think. But I would encourage all of you, now that you've learned this new term, cisgender, to try to incorporate it somewhat into your own vocabulary, because I would agree. So saying things like a real man versus a trans man, or sort of calling that person out for what it is, and maybe you don't even need to. Like, maybe it's just a man, and there's no real need to necessarily say if they're cis or if they're trans. But I do think that if we could incorporate the word, cisgender into our vocabulary, it levels the playing field, and it takes away that natural hierarchy of normal versus abnormal, for sure. Yeah, good point. What else? Yep.
Hang on.
Oh, sorry, Becky.
Pass. Thanks. Just for the recording, it helps.
Yeah, thanks, David.
So Adi and I were discussing this the other day a little bit about how it just was LGB, and then it was LGBT, and then it was LGBTQ, and then there So at what point do we, as a human species, get beyond this need to categorize
Mhm.
everything?
Mhm.
When can we just be ourselves without having this need to categorize? Or will there always be a need
Yeah.
to put people into some category or
Yeah.
another?
So, good question. And I think that, like, you know, it's just how our human brain works. That's how we learn. Is that we categorize things, and then we're able to kind of, you know, understand things better. And so we have this like strong desire to do so. We have systems built around us that like force us to do this. You know, I mean, try to like be in a healthcare system that has an electronic medical record that only gives you a drop-down box and options, like, and then try to make that fit a gender-inclusive model. It's kind of a recipe for disaster. So we have systems that are built around us also that really like pigeonholes or force us into those categories. One thing that I really love about the word queer is that in my mind, queer is like the middle finger to like somebody asking like, what is your label? Like, tell me how you identify. You're like, queer. And they're like, well, what's that mean? You're like, yep, exactly. Right? Because that could mean anything to anybody. And so I think of the term queer, and once again, like there's lots of people who just identify with the term queer. Like whether they would say, yeah, you know, like, and I'm a gay man, but I identify with the term queer. Whatever that might be. But I always think about like, I had a really great friend and she identified as a lesbian through and through. You know, like was attracted to women and had partners that were all female, and she loved her community. She was a lesbian. And so she's dating this woman who ends up transitioning to a trans man. And now here's my friend who's like, oh my goodness. I'm a lesbian, and yet I'm in love with this person, and I validate his identity. Like, he is a man, he's a trans man, and yet I am not straight. Like, I'm a lesbian, but I'm with a trans man. How do I make sense of that? What do I call myself? Queer. She calls herself queer. Like, that just makes sense then, right? Because it can mean, like, anything to anybody. So I do think that we can find words like that that are like the anti-label label, and that give us this sort of, you know, this ability to be just kind of non-specific with it. I'm encouraged often, so let's say like City High, their Gay Straight Alliance Club, they're called GLOW, gay, lesbian, or whatever. Like that, it doesn't get better than that. That's like Maria Bello, right? Like she's like, so call me a whatever. So kind of just in the face of that, like, why do you need to have a label about me? Like, what does that really mean? And then the other part of that I would say though is I always do want to push back just a little bit from like, but why does it matter? Like, shouldn't we treat everyone the same? And if we get rid of all labels, then do we have to treat everyone the same? And I think that that's the wrong direction to go also, because there's so much to know and to think about. There's so much privilege to be recognized, to bring to the table, that we would lose if we said get rid of all labels and treat everyone the same, because it doesn't matter. Does that make sense? Okay. Who else? Questions about terms?
Go ahead.
Good, Jackie.
I had a quick question about titles. So you were talking about pronouns, but what about titles, like the Mr. Ms. thing?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So sometimes MX, so mix, would be used some as sort of like a non-binary title for somebody who would identify as a non-binary person. Could be used. You know, I think asking people how they want to be referred to and just using first names is the best way to go. Typically, I mean, I know that there's situations where you just can't. Maybe if you're writing a letter or something like that, I don't know, but I'd say you could still just use the person's first and last name too, though. But yeah, MX would be your go-to for a non-binary person, typically. We're gonna have just the Mock and Jackie questionnaire show here.
Katie, it's confidential, stop using our name.
I'm sorry.
So here's my question, in my line of work, if a person comes in, it's a little bit difficult to know when you should ask.
Yeah,
And it's not something I would ask every time everyone comes in, which
Yeah.
is kind of how I like to, a rule, right? Just so when someone comes in, you always treat everyone the same and ask that question. But I'm not a doctor, we don't fill out
Right.
charts and figure out
right.
how this person identifies.
Mhm.
And I certainly do have clients that come in and prefer specific pronouns.
Yeah,
It's hard to know how to broach that in a
Yeah.
professional setting.
yeah. So, that's a great point. And like, you know, as I was going through this lecture and I took a lot of things out because I'm just sort of like, yeah, you know, like, I guess normal people don't ask about these things in regular conversation. Like, I ask about these things all the time, right? But it's because I'm in an exam room with someone and it's just really natural to talk about all of these sorts of things. But when I hear your question, I do think about how, like, it is just what happens in college now. You go to college, and it's the first day of class, and they go around and they say, like, what's your name and your pronoun?
Yeah.
And everybody does it, you know? And like, so I don't do it with all of my patients, but I feel like I'm on this journey where I'm eventually gonna get there. Like, I'm gonna get there with everybody and just say, like, hey, my name's Katie, what's your name and what are your pronouns? I like to be she, you know, I use she, her, hers, which is what I do with all my trans patients because I know that they're coming to see me because it says, like, here for hormones. So, you know, I mean, I think that that's the way around it, is it's just, like, it's in my email sig now, you know, I have my name in my email, I have what my pronouns are. I mean, it's becoming a little bit more commonplace. I think that the risk is that potentially you sort of force the issue with someone who's not maybe ready to come out, and then they have to make this decision, do they lie or do they not, you know, but inherent in the ask is a show of support, right? Like, it's like, if you're savvy enough to ask or to give your own pronouns, then the assumption should be probably more than an assumption, but the reality is that you're at least supportive enough to even know that you should even ask about that, you know? So, so that would be my answer, is if you feel like you need to sort of ask everybody what that question is, then I would just add it, like, this is what I like to be called, these are my pronouns, what can I call you, what pronouns do you like to use? And you might be surprised. Yeah, Judy.
Can I ask one more before you, Judy?
Yeah, David.
Since I'm holding mine. Katie, have you had instances with families who have a hard time with a loved one or a friend, let's say, who's transitioning?
Yeah.
And then what do you say to those family members who may be experiencing real turmoil or grief
Yeah.
or confusion? What are the resources? What do you say?
Yeah, so specifically when we talk about, you know, trans people, but I think that you could have some of those same feelings of, like, grief and loss with even if folks are coming out as lesbian, gay, or bi, or pan, whatever that it might be. So I see that quite often. You know, I have a bias sample because people who come to see me, their parents are bringing them. So if I have a minor child, their parents are at least supportive enough to bring them to see me. So for every kid that comes to see me, there's probably 10 whose parents are no way near supportive enough to even walk through my door. But even with those kids who do have supportive parents who come to see me, I mean, there's lots of them that are just on this journey and trying to do the best that they can, but don't understand and really confused and so scared, and they are really grieving. I mean, so this is one thing that we know for sure, is that grieving is just part of that process, even as that person. Like, you may be grieving what you thought your life was going to be, or grieving that part of your life, but for sure as parents who have your whole life planned, when they hold your little 6-pound body in their hands, this is the wedding, and this is the person and the life, and all of a sudden, like, that has to die, and you have to have imagination for something else. And so we talk a lot about therapy. I love our marriage and family therapist. You know, I mean, I think it's real important to like it's normal. Like you are crying, you have tears. Like that's normal. This is like real loss and grief, and go through it, and then be so darn proud of what this is gonna be, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that it's just real. You just have to like recognize it, let them have it, lean into it.
So in the questioning somebody else about what their pronouns are or how they identify, it strikes me that there's a generational gap. in
Yeah.
that. So I have some close friends who are older, and I understand that they're lesbian. I don't know that I've ever even said it to them,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm not sure that they are comfortable discussing it. It's just not,
Yeah.
you know, do you see that as a transitional thing? I don't know if you,
Yeah.
if you see a lot of people who are.
Yeah. You know, I don't as much as my colleague. She does see a lot of folks that maybe, I think that my average age is probably like 23. Part of what also makes my panel so great. I have a bunch of young, healthy people, but yes, so like, and I think it's just like, it's our times, right? Like kids are coming out as lesbian or gay or bi or even trans, like at the age of 13 or 14, you know, or like 12. I mean, like, I think of what I could have, all the turmoil I could have avoided if I would have been able to come out at that age, right? Like it would have been awesome. So it's just, I think, a product of where society is and where culture is. And, you know, whether or not you actually need to know to have a deep relationship with somebody is another question. You know, I really like questions just sort of saying like, is there a specific term or word that you use to identify your gender? Is there a specific term or word that you use to identify your sexuality? And have it part of a larger discussion. Like what do they actually identify with? What makes sense to them? What are the words that they would like for you to use when talking to them or about them? So that's how I would probably approach it. And they may definitely say like, I don't even think about it, or whatever that it might be. 80.
You've already answered this, but could you say one more time the difference between non-binary and trans umbrella?
Yep, so trans umbrella would be like big umbrella. So trans umbrella could fit anything. So you're binary, like you're trans men, trans women, and then you're non-binary as well. So trans umbrella, big umbrella, non-binary, smaller umbrella within the larger trans umbrella, which has lots of those terms. Agender, gender fluid, third gender, androgynous, all of those. Becky.
Will you still, can you just give a definition of non-binary?
Yeah, so non-binary is somebody,
And,
yeah.
and versus bi.
Yes, non-binary is someone who does not ascribe to only two gender options. So they would sort of say like man and woman, there's got to be more complexity than that. So I don't necessarily feel like I am a cis man or even a trans man or a cis woman or a trans woman. I feel like there's got to be space in the middle. There has to be a continuum. Sorry, I don't think that I actually did define that, so thank you. Yeah, so that would be non-binary, just not ascribing to only two options. And then bisexual versus pansexual. So true sense, bisexual means that you are attracted to like cis men and cis women, and pansexual means all genders. Cis men, trans men, non-binary, cis women, trans women, everybody. Match.com, no gender limits.
We have time for one more. Yours. Yeah, go for it.
I'm thinking about it from the educational world.
Yeah.
And in a school environment where sometimes our teachers aren't even familiar with our students' families at all.
Yeah.
And how to navigate that. You know,
Yeah.
sometimes saying to a kiddo, because you don't know if it's
Yeah.
two moms or two dads, or just any advice that you have from that area.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that trying to translate some of these concepts of gender and sexual inclusivity into some of those more, whatever that it might be, right? So if it's like an activity or language where instead of saying things like, make sure that you give this homework to your mom and dad, right? Like, make sure that you take this home with you to your family. And, you know, because sometimes it's grandparents and whoever that might make up their family. So, I mean, I think that that's the big thing is just trying to watch what your language is and trying to make sure that you are inclusive of what their family structure may look like. And the same thing when you have activities or family trees that you're making or any of those types of things, just being really mindful about that. Yeah, anything else that you're specifically thinking about there?
I'm just sometimes thinking because I don't even know if we always as teachers know, like what they tell their parents even.
Yeah.
Or, so that's always, I mean, sometimes can be really tricky and I think some teachers, just aren't sure what to do.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I'm like a big proponent of like just asking too. Like, you know, like it sounds like it would be a good exercise just to kind of say like, let's talk about who lives at home with us and what we call those people. Like I call my grandma, you know, whatever, like Noni and my Papa or whatever that it is. And I call my mommy and then I have a mama and however that you might use that language. So that sounds like depending on the age that it might be a nice activity as well and potentially fruitful for all the kids. So awesome. I'm sure going to stick around for a while, so if anybody has any more questions, feel free to come up and ask me them. But I appreciate everyone coming and braving the weather. Tuesday nights have been awful for us. Like, 4 weeks in a row we've had awful Tuesday nights, so I'm glad that we did it. So thank you, Edie. I'm glad that I made it.
Do you want me to close it? Yep, that was it. This concludes everything. We were going to give her a round of applause. We only did. I have to say I'm super grateful to Katie that she came and that she can do this for us and all that she's giving her life to. So